There is something nobody tells you about being the person who feels everything. They hand you words like empath and sensitive soul and highly attuned, and for a moment those words feel like a gift. Like finally, after years of not understanding why a room full of people drains you completely, why a single harsh word can echo inside you for days, why you can feel the tension between two people before either of them has spoken a single syllable. Finally, someone has named what you are. But here's what those words leave out. Here is the part they never put on the motivational poster or the Instagram graphic. That sensitivity, that extraordinary ability to feel and read and absorb the world around you. In most cases, it was not born from safety. It was not a gift handed to you by a generous universe. It was carved out of you by circumstances that should never have been yours to carry. And that changes everything about what it means to hold it. Most people who identify as empaths have been told their whole lives that their sensitivity is beautiful, and parts of it are. But beauty and burden are not opposites. And for the specific kind of person this video is about, the trauma-born empath loner, they have almost always existed in the same breath. You are not simply someone who feels deeply. You are someone who learned to feel deeply, because at some point in your early life, your survival depended on it. You learned to read the atmosphere of a room because you needed to know, before anyone spoke, whether the environment was safe. You learned to track micro-expressions and tonal shifts and the specific quality of silence before a storm because no one taught you how to trust that things would be okay. You had to know first. You had to see it coming. And so your nervous system built something extraordinary out of that necessity. It became a finely tuned instrument for reading other human beings. But that instrument was built under pressure, in the dark, and it has never fully been turned off since. This is where the conversation has to become more honest than most people are comfortable with. Because trauma-born empathy is not the same as natural openness. Natural openness expands toward people freely. Trauma-born empathy scans them. Natural openness is curious about others without cost. Trauma-born empathy pays for every encounter in exhaustion afterward. Natural openness allows connection without dissolving into it. Trauma-born empathy has almost no membrane between self and other, because that membrane was never allowed to form properly when you grew up in an environment where love was unpredictable, where emotional safety was something you had to earn moment by moment, rather than something freely given. The psyche does not develop a clear boundary between your inner world and the emotional world of the people around you. Instead, it develops hyper-attunement, a state of constant readiness, a baseline alertness that never fully quiets, even decades later, even when you are technically safe, even when nothing threatening is happening anywhere near you. And this is the thing that the 1% statistic in this video's title is really about. Not that only 1% of people are trauma-born empath-loners. More people carry this pattern than anyone would like to admit. The 1% is about survival, psychological survival. Because what happens to most people who carry this level of sensitivity without understanding its origin is one of three things. They burn out completely, retreating from the world into a loneliness that starts to feel permanent. They numb themselves, shutting down the very perceptive apparatus that once defined them, becoming a quieter and quieter version of themselves until even they cannot hear what they are feeling, or they remain in a state of chronic overwhelm, moving from relationship to relationship, situation to situation, pouring themselves out for others, and wondering why no one seems to pour anything back. Very few, and this is the honest truth, very few find the third path. The path where sensitivity does not cost you yourself. The path where you learn to feel everything without being destroyed by it. Where the instrument your trauma built becomes something you play consciously rather than something that plays you. This video is about that path. But before we can talk about how to walk it, we have to look clearly at what trauma-born empathy actually is, what it does to a person over time, and why loners in particular carry this pattern in its most concentrated form. Because the combination, trauma, empathy, and solitude, is not random. It is not coincidence. It is cause and effect layered over years, building a specific kind of person who is at once extraordinarily perceptive and extraordinarily isolated, who longs for connection more deeply than most people ever will, and yet finds the reality of closeness almost unbearable. Who can see into another person's pain with almost surgical clarity, yet struggles to articulate their own. Who has spent so much of their life being the one who holds space for everyone else that they have almost no idea what it would feel like for someone to hold space for them. If any part of what you just heard landed in your chest in a specific way, not just intellectually, but somewhere underneath that, then this video was made for you. And I want you to stay with it, because what comes next is not a list of coping strategies or a gentle reassurance that everything is fine. What comes next is something rarer, an honest map of the psychological territory that trauma-born empath loners actually inhabit. The stages they move through, the specific dangers waiting at each stage, and what it actually takes, not in a theoretical sense, but in a lived, difficult, real sense, to cross from survival into something that deserves to be called a life. We begin where all of it begins, not in adulthood, not in your most recent difficult relationship or your most recent moment of overwhelming exhaustion in a social situation. We begin in the original wound, the place where the hyper-attunement started, because you cannot understand what you are carrying now without first understanding what built it. And most people, even people who have done significant inner work, have only looked at that origin story through a partial lens. They see the pain, they see the dysfunction. What they miss is the extraordinary intelligence of the response. What they miss is how ingeniously, how completely the child you once were adapted to an environment that gave them no other choice. That story, the story of how a sensitive child becomes a trauma-born empath loner, is where we go next. Picture a child who grows up in a home where the emotional temperature changes without warning. Not necessarily a home with visible violence or obvious crisis, though sometimes it is that too. More often it is subtler than that. A parent whose mood determines the weather of the entire house. A love that feels genuine on some days and completely conditional on others. An atmosphere where the child learns very early that their job, their unspoken, never assigned, but absolutely understood job, is to sense what the adults around them need and to become whatever version of themselves will keep the peace. This child does not make a conscious decision to become hyper-attuned. They do not sit down one afternoon and think, I will now develop an extraordinary sensitivity to the emotional states of everyone around men. It happens the way all deep adaptation happens. Gradually, invisibly, in the gap between what a child needs and what they are actually given. What this child learns first and most fundamentally is that their own inner world is secondary. Their hunger for stability, their need for unconditional warmth, their desire to simply exist without monitoring the room. All of it gets subordinated to the larger task of reading and managing the emotional environment around them. And because children are not equipped to name what is happening to them, they do not experience this as loss. They experience it as identity. This is who I am. I am the one who feels everything. I am the one who knows when something is wrong before anyone says a word. I am the one people come to when they are hurting. I am the one who holds things together. And for a long time, sometimes for decades, that identity feels like a kind of purpose. It feels like meaning. It feels, in some quietly devastating way, like love. But underneath that identity, something else is forming. Something the child cannot see, and the adult will spend years trying to understand. A self that was never fully allowed to exist. a set of needs that were never named because naming them felt dangerous, an inner world that learned to be invisible in order to survive. And this is the origin of the loner pattern that so many trauma-born empaths develop as they move into adolescence and adulthood. It is not that they do not want connection. Anyone who tells you that empath-aloners are simply people who prefer to be alone has missed the entire point. The truth is almost the opposite. Trauma-born empath-aloners crave connection with an intensity that most people never experience. They want to be known, really known, not the version of themselves they perform for the comfort of others, but the actual interior self that has been weighted angry quietly behind all that attunement and caregiving and emotional labor. They want someone to see that person and stay. The problem is that the very mechanism that makes them so perceptive also makes genuine connection feel nearly impossible. Because when you have spent your formative years learning that your value depends on what you can sense and manage and provide for others, intimacy becomes a complicated and often terrifying thing. You walk into closeness with a person, and within moments your nervous system is doing what it has always done, scanning, reading, anticipating, adjusting. You are tracking their mood shifts. You are sensing their unspoken needs. You are quietly reshaping yourself to fit the emotional contours of the space between you. And somewhere in the middle of all that labor, you lose the thread back to yourself. The connection that was supposed to feel like relief starts to feel like just another version of the exhausting vigilance you have always known. And so you pull back, not because you do not care, because you care so much, and in such an untrained and unprotected way that staying close starts to cost you something you cannot afford to keep paying. This is the push-pull that defines so much of the trauma-born empath-loner's relational life. The longing and the withdrawal existing simultaneously, creating a rhythm that looks confusing from the outside and feels maddening from the inside. You want people close, and then when they get close, you need them to step back. You invest deeply in relationships and then feel suffocated by the very depth you created. You are the person others describe as warm and perceptive and genuinely caring. And you are also the person who disappears sometimes without fully being able to explain why. And the real reason underneath the reason is that no one ever taught you how to be in connection without dissolving into it. No one modeled what it looked like to remain yourself while also being close to someone else. The only template you had was self-erasure in service of harmony. And eventually, some part of you learned that the only safe place to be fully yourself was alone. So solitude becomes something more than preference. It becomes sanctuary. The only environment where the hyper-attunement can finally rest, where the constant scanning of emotional atmospheres can briefly quiet, where you do not have to be anything for anyone and can simply exist in the rare luxury of your own unmediated inner world. And there is something genuinely beautiful about what trauma-born empath-loners build in that solitude. A richness of inner life that most people never develop. A relationship with their own thoughts and feelings and perceptions that is unusually deep and unusually honest. A capacity for self-reflection that borders on the extraordinary. But there is also a danger that lives in that same solitude, and it is a danger that grows quietly over time in a way that is easy to miss until it has already done significant damage. The danger is this: when solitude becomes the only safe place, it stops being a place you choose and starts being a place you are trapped. The sanctuary becomes a kind of exile. And the longer you stay in it, the longer you go without practicing that terrifying and necessary skill of remaining yourself, all in genuine contact with another person, the harder it becomes to believe that such a thing is even possible for you. You start to construct a story, usually unconscious. usually made of accumulated evidence from every relationship that confirm your deepest fear. The story goes something like this. I am too much. I feel too deeply. I see too clearly. I need too much space. I give too much, and then I have nothing left. I am not built for this. Kind of connection other people seem to manage so easily. And that story, once it settles into the bones of your identity, becomes one of the most dangerous things a trauma-born empath loner carries. Not because it is entirely false, but because it is not entirely true either. And the part that is not true is precisely the part that contains every possibility for something different. Here's what that story leaves out. Here is the part the accumulated evidence never shows you, because evidence only ever shows you what has already happened, never what becomes possible once something fundamental shifts. That story, I am too much. I am not built for connection. Solitude is the only place I am safe, was written by a nervous system that learned its lessons in conditions that no longer fully exist. It was authored by a child who had no other options, ratified by an adolescent who was still in the same environment, and carried forward by an adult who never received the information that the original conditions had changed. And this is perhaps the most important psychological insight in this entire video, so stay with it for a moment. The hyperattunement that trauma built in you was never a flaw. It was a solution, an extraordinarily intelligent, remarkably effective solution to a specific problem. The problem was an environment where emotional unpredictability was a genuine threat, and we're learning to anticipate that unpredictability was a genuine form of protection. The solution worked. You survived. But solutions that were built for one environment do not automatically update when the environment changes. And so you are walking around in an adult life in circumstances that are in many ways genuinely different from the ones that built you, still running a program that was written for a world that was much more dangerous than the one you currently inhabit. This is not a small thing to understand. It is not a simple reframe that makes everything easier, but it is the beginning of the only kind of change that actually lasts for people who carry this pattern. Because the moment you genuinely understand that your sensitivity is not a permanent character defect, that it is a learned strategy that can be learned differently, the ground shifts beneath everything, not instantly, not without difficulty, but it shifts. And once it shifts, even slightly, you begin to see options that the story of, I am not built for this completely obscures from view. You begin to see that there is a difference between feeling everything and being responsible for everything you feel. You begin to notice the gap, and at first it is a tiny gap, barely perceptible, between someone's emotional state entering your awareness and your nervous system treating it as your emergency to solve. That gap is everything. That gap is where your actual life is waiting for you. But to widen that gap, you have to do something that goes against every instinct your survival system has. You have to stay, not in relationships that harm you. That is not what this is about. You have to stay present to your own experience in moments when every trained reflex in your body is urging you to redirect your attention outward, because this is the specific pattern that keeps trauma-born empath loners locked in the exhaustion cycle. The moment anything arises internally, discomfort, need, anger, grief, longing, the hyperattuned system immediately does what it was trained to do. It scans outward. It finds something in the environment to focus on, someone to read, someone to help, something to manage. And in that outward turn, your own inner experience gets quietly abandoned. Again, the way it was abandoned when you were small. Except this time, you are the one doing the abandoning. N-U-D. Oh, it's so automatically, so completely that you often do not even realize it has happened until you are sitting alone at the end of another day, wondering why you feel so hollow. Despite having spent every hour of it being present and available and caring for everything except yourself. Learning to stay with your own experience, to let your own feelings be as real and as worthy of attention as everyone else's, is not a soft skill. It is not a gentle journaling practice or a 5-minute meditation you do in the morning before the day swallows you whole. For a trauma-born empath loner, it is an act of profound courage because the original environment taught you at the level of the nervous system that your own needs were either dangerous to express or simply irrelevant to the people around you. Turning your attention inward and keeping it there long enough to actually feel what is present without immediately converting that feeling into concern for someone else, without analyzing it away, without deciding it is too much and shutting it down, is an act of going against years of deeply embedded programming. It will feel uncomfortable. It will feel selfish in the specific way that only feels selfish to people who were trained to believe their worth was entirely tied to their usefulness to others. It will feel like you are doing something wrong even while you are, for perhaps the first time, doing something exactly right. And here's what happens when you begin to do it consistently. When you begin to give your own inner world the same quality of patient, non-judgmental attention you have given to everyone else's for your entire life. The hyper-attunement does not disappear. That is not the goal, and it would not be possible anyway. It is too deeply woven into how you perceive the world, but it begins to serve you rather than consume you. You begin to use it with something, anxiety resembling choice, rather than being used by it automatically. You walk into a room and you still sense the emotional currents moving through it. You always will, but there is a growing capacity to notice them without immediately being pulled into them. To register information without converting it into obligation. To feel the emotional reality of another person without losing the thread back to your own. This is not detachment. Detachment is what happens when the system shuts down from exhaustion, when it has absorbed so much for so long that it simply goes quiet to protect itself. What begins to develop instead is something far more valuable than detachment. It is discernment, the ability to be fully present and simultaneously fully yourself, the ability to care without carrying, to understand without merging, to witness without disappearing. This shift changes the nature of solitude too. When you are beginning to develop this capacity, you start to notice that the quality of your aloneness changes. It stops being the exhausted collapse of someone who has spent all day being everything for everyone else. It starts becoming something more intentional, more chosen. You are alone, not because connection defeated you, but because you are learning to value your own company in a way that is not just about hiding from the world, but about genuinely being with yourself. And paradoxically, the more genuinely you can be with yourself in solitude, the less terrifying it becomes to be genuinely with another person in connection. Because what made connection so costly before was that you brought no self to it. You brought only your attunement, your availability, your capacity to sense and respond. Now slowly you're beginning to bring an actual person, someone with needs and limits and an interior life that matters. And the relationships that can hold that, the rare realness that can sustain contact between two actual selves, rather than between a self and a mirror. Those relationships begin to become possible in a way they never quite were before. This is the threshold the 1% actually reaches. Not a place of perfect healing or permanent peace, not a life without difficulty or loneliness, or the occasional devastating social hangover that comes from being a person built the way you are built, but a life in which sensitivity is no longer exclusively a wound, in which the extraordinary perceptive capacity that your early pain developed has been gradually pain as something that belongs to you rather than something that runs you, in which solitude is a home you have chosen rather than a prison you have slowly constructed around yourself without fully realizing it was happening. That threshold is real. It is reachable. But there is one more stage that stands between where most trauma-born empath aloners currently are and where that threshold begins. One more passage that must be understood and navigated before any of what was just described becomes genuinely possible rather than just intellectually interesting. And it is the stage almost no one talks about because it is the least comfortable, the least flattering, and in many ways the most necessary. The stage almost no one talks about has a simple name but a complicated reality. It is the stage of honest reckoning, not with what was done to you. You have likely spent considerable time there already, and that work matters. But with what you have done with what was done to you, with the ways the wound became a weapon, not against others necessarily, but against yourself, with the patterns you have maintained long past the point where they served any protective purpose, with the identity you built around your sensitivity that, for all its genuine insight and depth, has also become a way of staying small, a way of remaining in the story of, I feel too much, and the world cannot hold me, rather than risking the terrifying alternative, which is to find out whether that story is actually true. Here's what honest reckoning looks like for a trauma-born empath loner. It looks like acknowledging that the withdrawal, as necessary as it sometimes genuinely is, has also been used as armor. That the solitude, as genuinely restorative as it can be, has also been used as avoidance. That the sensitivity, as real and as profound as it is, has also been used as an explanation for never fully showing up in your own life. That the exhaustion, which is completely real and completely valid, has also on some occasions been arrived at, not because the world demanded too much of you, but because you gave yourself away preemptively, unconsciously, the way you always learned to before anyone even asked. This is not about blame. Blame is the least useful currency in this entire conversation. This is about clarity, because without this particular clarity, every tool and practice and insight available to you will eventually be unconsciously rerouted back into the service of the old pattern. You will meditate and use the stillness to dissociate rather than to feel. You will set boundaries and use them to isolate rather than to protect genuine connection. You will do the inner work and use the language of that work to construct a more sophisticated version of the same story. I am a trauma-born empath loner. I have done the work. I understand my patterns. And still, somehow, I am alone. The honest reckoning asks you to look at something that lives right at the edge of what the hyper-attuned, deeply self-aware, psychologically sophisticated person you are can tolerate seeing about themselves. It asks you to consider the possibility that part of you, a quiet, stubborn, deeply frightened part, does not actually want to be fully known. That the longing for deep connection, which is absolutely genuine, coexists with an equally genuine terror of it. And that terror has been steering far more of your decisions than you have been willing to admit. Because if you are never fully known, you are never fully rejected. If you remain just slightly out of reach, warm enough to feel the longing, distant enough to stay protected, then you never have to find out whether the core fear is true. The fear that says, if someone saw all of it, the need and the anger and the grief and the exhaustion and the parts of you that are not wise or perceptive or beautifully sensitive, but simply human and hungry and scared, they would leave. And that fear, unexamined, runs the entire show. It decides who you let close and how close you let them get. It decides when you withdraw and what story you tell yourself about why. It decides quietly and persistently and with remarkable effectiveness that safety is more important than aliveness. And it keeps on deciding that year after year until one day you look up and realize that you have built a life that is deeply interior and genuinely perceptive and profoundly lonely in a way that has stopped feeling like a stage and started feeling like a permanent condition. The way through this, the actual way through, not the way that looks like through, but loops back to the beginning, requires something that will sound almost insultingly simple, given everything that led to it. It requires letting one person see you inaccurately and staying anyway, not performing vulnerability, which the psychologically sophisticated person is very good at. Sharing the right amount of the right kind of pain and right framing so that it lands as depth rather than need. Actually being seen imperfectly, being misread or partially read, or seen in a way that is slightly off from the truth of what you are, and not immediately withdrawing or correcting or managing the impression or deciding that this person simply does not have the capacity to understand you. Because that last move, the conclusion that no one quite has the capacity to understand you, is the final and most elegant form of the armor. It sounds like discernment. It feels like wisdom. And it functions as a guarantee that the risk of real contact never fully has to be taken. Real contact is not finding the one person who sees you completely and immediately and perfectly. Real contact is the gradual, imperfect, mutually awkward process of two people who are both carrying their histories toward each other and choosing, despite all the very good reasons not to keep showing up. It is not the resonance you feel when someone seems to already understand you without explanation. That feeling, as beautiful as it is, often has more to do with recognition of shared wounds than with genuine intimacy. Real intimacy is built in the discomfort. In the moment when you have been misunderstood and you say so, rather than quietly filing it as evidence. In the moment when you need something and you ask for it, rather than waiting to see if they notice. In the moment when you want to disappear and you say, I want to disappear right now, rather than simply disappearing. These moments are not natural for a trauma-born empath loner. They feel dangerous in a way that is disproportionate to the actual risk, because the nervous system is still consulting the old map. But they are the precise moments in which the old map gets updated, in which the psyche receives new information, in which the story begins slowly to be rewritten from the inside. And this is what surviving this pattern actually looks like. Not the dramatic transformation where everything becomes clear and the sensitivity stops hurting and the right people appear and the solitude becomes peaceful overnight. It looks like choosing one moment of genuine contact over one moment of elegant withdrawal, then doing it again after the time it does not go well and your nervous system screams that this is proof you were right to always stay guarded. Surviving this in the real sense, the 1% sense, is not a destination. It is a direction, a daily, undramatic, deeply personal choice to be more present in your own life than you were yesterday. To let your sensitivity be something that opens you rather than something that closes you down. To bring the extraordinary perceptive capacity that your pain developed into the service of genuine living rather than sophisticated surviving. You were built for more than endurance. The same depth that made you a reader of rooms and a carrier of others and an expert in the emotional weather of every environment you have ever entered. That depth turned inward and then outward again with choice rather than compulsion is one of the rarest and most valuable things a human being can develop. Not because it makes you special in the way that needs an audience, but because it makes you real in the way that changes everything. The trauma-born empath loner who reaches the other side of this does not become a different person. They become, perhaps for the first time, fully the person they always were underneath all of it. And that person, that specific, particular, extraordinary, and ordinary person, deserves to be known. Not by everyone, but by someone. Starting, and this is the part that cannot be skipped with themselves, That is where the 1% begins. Not in the arrival, in the turning. Nobody warned you about the quiet ones. The ones who never slam doors. The ones who never raise their voices in the middle of an argument. The ones who sit across from someone who is hurting them and still find a way to ask if that person is okay. Nobody warned you about what happens when those people finally reach the end of something. Because when they do, it doesn't look like what you expect. It doesn't look like a breakdown. It doesn't look like tears or shouting or a dramatic exit. It looks like a Tuesday. It looks like a normal conversation where one person gives a slightly shorter answer than usual. It looks like a text that takes a little longer to arrive. It looks like someone who used to light up when you walked in the room, now simply looking up and then looking back down. That's it. That's the whole thing. And somehow that quietness is the loudest thing that has ever happened in the room. This is the story of what happens the day the empath snaps. But before we go there, we need to go back, because you cannot understand the snap without understanding the silence that came before it. You cannot understand the withdrawal without understanding everything the empath absorbed before they finally stopped absorbing. Most people think empaths are sensitive because they feel too much. That's not the whole truth. Empaths feel precisely. They feel the shift in your energy when you walk in carrying something you haven't said yet. They feel the small difference between the way you laugh when something is genuinely funny and the way you laugh when you're performing happiness for the room. They feel the exact moment a conversation stops being a conversation and starts being a negotiation. And because they feel all of this with that kind of precision, they spend an enormous amount of energy doing something most people never notice: managing the emotional temperature of every room they walk into. They turn down their own needs so the atmosphere stays comfortable. They translate their hurt into something softer and more palatable before they hand it to you, because they have already predicted your reaction and they don't want to cause a scene. They tell themselves they are being understanding. They tell themselves they are being patient. And for a long time, they believe it. But there is a difference between patience and self-erasure. And the empath, who is so gifted at reading everyone else, is often the last person to read that distinction in themselves. Here is what no one talks about. The empath doesn't just feel your emotions, they carry them. There's a difference. Feeling means the emotion passes through you. Carrying means you take it with you. It sits in your chest at 2 a.m. It colors the way you see yourself. It slowly becomes indistinguishable from your own inner world. So when the empath has been in a relationship, romantic, friendship, family, it doesn't matter where they are consistently required to absorb someone else's mood, someone else's unprocessed anger, someone else's emotional instability, they don't just get tired. They get full. There is no more room. The box is at capacity. And the cruelest part of this is that the empath often doesn't realize how full they are until something incredibly small tips it over. A tone of voice, a dismissive gesture, a moment where they tried to say that hurt me, and the response was not curiosity, not care, not even a real apology, just redirection, just defense, just another moment of being made to feel like their pain was an inconvenience they were inflicting on someone else. And in that moment, something shifts. Not loudly, not violently, the way a bone doesn't snap under a single blow, but under the accumulated pressure of years, and then all at once. The empath doesn't get angry, not in the way you might expect. Something colder and more final happens. The hoping stops. And when the hoping stops, something else rises in its place. Clarity, the kind of clarity that doesn't feel like relief. It feels like standing in a very quiet room after years of noise and realizing the noise was never coming from outside. It was coming from the story you kept telling yourself that if you loved enough, explained enough, tried enough, stayed soft enough, something would finally change. The snap is the moment that story ends. What makes this so difficult for the people around the empath is that they were not watching the buildup. They saw the person who always showed up. They saw the one who always forgave. They saw the one who had an endless capacity for giving people another chance and another and one more after that. They built an entire model of who this person was based on that behavior. And so when the empathist snaps, when the warmth cools and the effort stops and the door that was always open suddenly requires a knock, it reads as a personality change. It reads as cruelty. It reads as abandonment. People say you've changed, as if change is a betrayal, not a survival strategy. They say you used to be so open without asking what it cost to stay that open for that long. They say, I don't understand what happened, when what they mean is, I preferred the version of you that was easier for me. But here is the truth that this video is going to sit with for the next few minutes. The empath didn't change. The empath had arrived. What you are seeing when the empath goes quiet, goes still, stops performing warmth they no longer feel, that is not coldness. That is the first honest thing they have shown you in a very long time. The version that was always available, always forgiving, always finding a way to make your comfort their responsibility. That was the performance. This is the person. And the person has finally decided they are worth protecting. Let's talk about what the buildup actually looks like, because this is the part that gets skipped over, and it's the most important part to understand, not just for the empath listening to this, but for anyone who has ever loved one and wondered how things got so far without them noticing. The buildup doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a warning label. It looks from the outside like everything is fine. It looks like the empath is handling it. It looks like they're okay. And the reason it looks that way is because the empath is working extremely hard to make it look that way. That is the whole tragedy of it. The very skill that makes them extraordinary, their ability to hold space, to regulate emotion, to keep the peace, becomes the thing that hides the damage until the damage is done. Here is how the buildup works in practice. Early in the relationship, the empath notices something, a pattern. Maybe it's the way you shut down when they try to bring up something difficult. Maybe it's the way a conversation about their needs somehow always ends up being about your feelings. Maybe it's the way that when they say, I'm struggling, the response is sympathetic for about 30 seconds before the subject changes. They notice it, they file it somewhere, and then because this is what empaths do, they give you the benefit of the doubt. They construct a generous explanation. You're stressed. You had a hard childhood. You don't mean it the way it sounds. You're doing your best. They believe these things not because they are naive, but because they are genuinely capable. Lay of holding complexity. They can see your wound and love you through it at the same time. That capacity is real, and it is beautiful, and it is also the thing that keeps them in rooms they should have left much earlier. And they adjust. They learn which topics are safe and which ones will trigger a reaction they'll spend days recovering from. They learn to soften their language, to approach difficult conversations at the right time of day, to read your body language before deciding whether tonight is a night they can be honest. They become fluent in a language of careful navigation, and they speak it so naturally that after a while they forget it isn't their native tongue. They forget that they used to say what they meant without doing 12 calculations first. They forget what it felt like to have a feeling and simply express it without bracing for the impact. And alongside all of this quiet adaptation, something else is happening. The empath is accumulating. Every time they swallowed something that hurt, it didn't disappear. Every time they decided this wasn't the right moment to bring something up, that moment got stored somewhere in the body. Every apology they gave that they didn't actually owe. Every time they talked themselves out of their own perception because you seemed so convinced they were wrong. Every night they lay awake replaying a conversation and wondering whether they were too much, too sensitive, too needy, when really they were just a person who wanted to be met halfway and kept being told the halfway point was a personal attack. All of it, every single instance, filed and stored and carried. And here is what people don't understand about that accumulation. It is not dramatic. It does not feel day to day like something catastrophic is building. It feels like being a little tired. It feels like needing a little more time alone than usual. It feels like going through the motions of a conversation without being fully present in it. It feels to the empath like they are simply managing, like this is just what relationships cost. Like everyone probably feels this way, and the ones who don't are just better at handling it because the empath spent so long prioritizing your emotional reality over their own that they have genuinely lost track of what their baseline is supposed to feel like. They don't know what it feels like to not be tired. They have forgotten what it is to enter a conversation without armor. Now here's the moment. Not the snap, we'll get there. The moment just before it. There comes a point where the empath tries one more time, not dramatically, not as an ultimatum. They try the way they always try, quietly, carefully. With the door held open for you, they say something honest. They let one real thing out. Maybe they say they have been feeling invisible. Maybe they say they need more than what they've been getting. Maybe they just let you see for one unguarded second that they are not okay, and they watch your face, and they wait. And what they need in that moment is not perfection. They don't need a grand gesture or a tearful revelation. They need one thing. They need to see that you are curious about them, that what they just said matters to you, that you are someone who can be moved by their reality. And if in that moment what they get instead is defensiveness, if what they get is a pivot to your feelings, or a minimization of theirs, or a version of you're too sensitive wrapped in slightly more sophisticated language, something registers, not as a feeling exactly, more like a fact, a quiet, devastating fact that the mind files without ceremony. This is not going to change, not because you are irredeemable, not because the relationship is worthless, but because change requires someone to first acknowledge that something needs changing. And if you cannot see it, if you have looked directly at their pain and found a way to make it about your own comfort, then the empath understands something they cannot ununderstand. They have been hoping for a version of you that does not exist. And hope, once it dies, that particular kind of death does not come back the same way. This is the breath before the snap. This is the last moment of the before. Everything after this is different. Now we are inside the snap itself. And I want to be precise here, because precision is what this moment deserves. The snap is not a decision the empath makes consciously. It is not something they plan. They do not wake up one morning and choose to become unreachable. What happens is quieter than that and more final. Something in the body simply stops volunteering. The hand that used to reach out automatically, the one that would smooth things over before they had a chance to become something bigger, that hand stays still. Not because the empath has become cold, not because they have stopped caring, but because the nervous system, which has been running an emergency response protocol for months or years, has finally done what nervous systems do when they are pushed past their limit. It has rerouted. It has stopped sending resources to the place that keeps getting depleted and started sending them somewhere new, somewhere internal, somewhere that belongs only to the empath on the outside. This looks like a personality transplant. The person who used to text back immediately now takes hours. The person who used to initiate the plans, the check-ins, the repairs after an argument has stopped initiating. The warmth that used to fill every interaction has been replaced by something neutral, polite, even, functional, but stripped of the particularity that made being around them feel like standing in sunlight. And the people in their life feel it immediately, even if they cannot name it. Something is different, something is gone. The instinct for most people is to try to get it back by doing the same things that always worked before. Guilt, pressure, performing hurt, asking why they're being so cold, demanding the old version return as if the old version was ever the whole picture and not just the part that was easiest to receive. What those people do not realize is that the strategies that worked before worked because the empath was still hoping. Guilt worked because the empath cared desperately about being good, about being fair, about making sure no one suffered on their account. Pressure worked because the empath was still running the calculation, maybe I am being too harsh, maybe I should give this one more chance. The performance of hurt worked because the empath's empathy was still fully operational, still picking up every signal, still willing to set aside their own pain to address yours. But those levers only function when hope is present. When hope is gone, the levers are disconnected. You can pull them as hard as you like. Nothing moves. This is the thing that frightens people most about the snapped empath, not the distance itself, but the realization that their usual tools do not work, that the dynamic has changed in a way they do not know how to reverse. And so they escalate. They push harder. They get louder, more insistent, more dramatic. And with each escalation, the empath retreats a little further, not out of cruelty, but out of confirmation. Because each push is data. Each demand for warmth without any accompanying offer of safety is evidence that supports the conclusion the empath has already reached. You are more interested in your own comfort than in understanding what happened to mine. But here is what I need the empath to hear right now, because this part matters just as much. The snap is not the destination. It is a doorway, and doorways can lead somewhere good or somewhere that simply looks like a different version of the same pain, because there are two things that can live inside the empath withdrawal, and they feel similar from the inside, but they are not the same thing. The first is a boundary. A boundary is clean. It has a shape you can describe. It says, I am no longer available for this specific dynamic, and here is what I need before I can open the door again. A boundary protects your peace while leaving your heart intact. It is firm, but it is not punishing. It knows what it is protecting and why. The second thing is a shutdown. A shutdown is not clean. A shutdown is what happens when the empath doesn't just close the door on the dynamic, but locks themselves inside and loses the key. It looks like detachment, but it feels like numbness. It looks like peace, but it is actually a kind of grief wearing very still clothing. The difference between the two comes down to what lives underneath the quiet. If you go still and underneath the stillness, there is a sense of something returning to you, some part of yourself you had been giving away. That is a boundary doing its work. That is your system recalibrating. That is healthy, even when it is hard. But if you go still and underneath the stillness, there is a hollow place, an ache that doesn't quite resolve, a sense that you have not protected yourself so much as disappeared yourself. That is shutdown. And shutdown is not the answer you are looking for. You are not trying to disappear. You are trying to be found by yourself first. Then, if it is safe, by the right people. This distinction is worth sitting with because the empath who does not know the difference can spend years believing they have healed when they have actually just built a very sophisticated wall and called it a boundary. The wall keeps the pain out, yes, but it also keeps everything else out, the softness, the joy, the particular electricity of genuine connection. You cannot selectively numb, you cannot close yourself off from the relationships that hurt you without also closing yourself off from the ones that could hold you. And the empath deserves to be held, not managed, not handled, not accommodated. Held, that is what they were always offering everyone else. That is what they forgot they were allowed to want for themselves. The snap is not the end of the story. It is the moment the real story begins. So where do you go from here? That is the only question that matters now. Not how did we get here? Not who was wrong. Not what could have been different. If different choices had been made at different moments along the way. Those questions have their place, and their place is later. Right now, the only question worth asking is the one that faces forward. Where do you go from here? And the answer is not a destination. It is a practice, a daily, imperfect, ongoing practice of choosing yourself in the small moments before the big ones demand it of you. If you are the empath, here is what I want you to understand first. What happened to you was not a character flaw. The capacity that made you absorb so much, give so much, bend so many times in the direction of other people's comfort. That capacity came from somewhere real. It came from a nervous system that learned, probably very early, that love was something you earned by being useful. That connection was something you maintained by being easy, that your needs were negotiable, but other people's needs were not. You learned that lesson in a context where it may have genuinely kept you safe, but you carried it forward into every room. I walked into after that, applying it to people and situations that no longer required that kind of self-erasure to survive. And so the work now is not to become someone without empathy. The world does not need less of your particular kind of feeling. The work is to become someone who applies that same quality of attention, that same precision, that same generosity, that same willingness to sit with complexity to yourself, to become as curious about your own inner world as you have always been about everyone else's. That starts with something deceptively simple. It starts with noticing the moment before the yes. There is always a moment, a fraction of a second between the request and the response where your body already knows the answer, where something in your chest tightens or drops or quietly contracts. Most empaths have learned to skip over that moment so fast it becomes invisible. The yes is already forming before the contraction has finished registering. The practice is to slow that fraction of a second down, to let the contraction speak before the accommodation answers. Not every contraction means no. Not every hesitation is a boundary being crossed, but some of them are, and you have spent long enough not knowing the difference. You are allowed to take up space in your own life. You are allowed to have needs that are not justified, explained, or softened before you hand them to someone. You are allowed to say, this is what I need, without first building a legal case for why your need is reasonable. You are allowed to be loved in a way that does not cost you yourself. That is not a high standard, that is the minimum. And if it feels like a high standard, that is information about every room you've been in that normalized something that should never have been normalized. Now, if you are someone watching this because you recognize yourself in the other role, Beck, as you are looking at someone in your life who has gone quiet, gone still, stopped reaching, I want to speak to you directly, and I want to do it without cruelty, because cruelty is not what this moment calls for. What this moment calls for is honesty. The empath in your life did not snap because they are dramatic. They did not withdraw because they want power over you. They withdrew because staying was costing them something they could not afford to keep paying. And the most important thing you can understand right now is that the thing you are feeling, the discomfort of their distance, the anxiety of their changed energy, the urgency to get back the version of them that felt warm and available, that feeling is useful information, but only if you let it point in the right direction. It is very easy to let that feeling point outward, to make their withdrawal the problem, to focus on what they are doing and how it is affecting you. That is the familiar move. That is the move that got you here. The harder move, and the only one that actually opens the door, is to let that feeling point inward, to ask not what are they doing, but what did I miss? Not why are they being like this, but what did it cost them to stay as long as they did? Not how do I get them back, but what kind of person do I need to become for them to feel safe again? And then critically, not performing the answer to that question, but living it consistently over time, without requiring them to reward you for the effort before the effort has proven itself real. Because the snapped empath is not unforgiving. They are not made of stone. They did not lose their capacity for connection the day they stopped performing it. What they lost was their tolerance for connection that costs more than it gives. And that is not a loss. That is a refinement. They are still capable of extraordinary love. They are still capable of the kind of presence that makes people feel genuinely seen. But that presence is no longer free, not because they have become transactional, but because they have finally understood something that took too long to learn. That love is not proven by how much you are willing to endure. Love is not a debt you pay with your own erasure. Love is not the thing that survives because one person refused to stop holding it together. Love that is real does not require one person to disappear inside it. The day the empath snaps is not a tragedy. It is, if you can see it clearly, an invitation. An invitation for the empath to come home to themselves. An invitation for the people around them to finally show up in a way that is equal to what they were always receiving. And an invitation for everyone in that room to stop confusing endurance with love and start learning what love actually looks like when both people are fully present, fully honest, and fully unwilling to disappear. That is where the real story begins. This time, the empath is in it too.